Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the hidden questlines buried inside Oblivion, the kind of quiet, half-forgotten stories that most players walk straight past without ever knowing they existed. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. The Lich who loved his friend. Somewhere in eastern Cyrodiil, far from any road a sensible traveller would choose, there is a cave called Lost Boy Cavern. It does not announce itself. There is no quest marker waiting to point you toward it. No NPC standing at a crossroads asking for your help. You simply find it, the way you find most of the saddest things in this world, by accident, while looking for something else entirely. Outside the entrance, half buried in dead leaves, lies a journal. It has no name attached to it in the way the game usually hands you context. You simply pick it up and you begin to read, and the story that unfolds is one of the quietest tragedies in all of Oblivion, made all the more affecting by how easily it could be missed. There's a particular skill in how the developers chose to introduce this story, asking nothing of the player beyond the simple act of picking up a single piece of parchment lying on the ground outside an otherwise unremarkable hole in the earth. No music shifts to signal importance. No glowing prompt urges you forward. The cave simply waits. The journal simply waits. And whatever happens next depends entirely on whether the player happens to be the sort who reads things lying around in the dirt, or the sort who walks past them in search of more obvious rewards. Many of the most affecting stories scattered throughout Cyrodiil share this exact quality, offering themselves freely to anyone curious enough to stop and look, while remaining permanently invisible to anyone moving too quickly to notice. The journal belongs to a spellzord named Vangaril, a man who, based on what we know from the scattered pages found deeper in the cave, once stood shoulder to shoulder with another mage in the Mages Guild. His friend's name was Erendur. They were, by every account left behind in ink and parchment, close. The kind of close that survives disagreements, that survives distance, that should have survived anything. There is something worth sitting with in just how ordinary this friendship must once have been, before any of what follows took hold. Two young mages, presumably, working through the same lessons, the same frustrations, the same small triumphs that come with finally mastering a difficult spell. Nothing in the cave tells you what they studied together, what jokes they shared, what made their bond strong enough that one of them would eventually walk alone into a forgotten cavern, rather than abandon the other to whatever fate had claimed him. You're left only with the aftermath, the way you so often are in stories like this, piecing together the shape of a friendship entirely from the wreckage it left behind. It is worth imagining too what the early years of that friendship inside the Mages Guild might genuinely have looked like. Two ambitious young men navigating the same hierarchy of instructors and examinations, perhaps competing playfully over who could master a particular spell first, perhaps simply finding comfort in having someone else nearby who understood the strange, isolating discipline that magical study demands. Most friendships of this depth are built slowly, through hundreds of small, unremarkable shared moments, rather than any single dramatic event, and the cave gives you none of those moments directly. It only gives you their absence, the gap left behind once everything that built the friendship had already collapsed. It did not survive necromancy. Erendur fell into the practice of the dark arts, the kind of magic the Mages Guild had outlawed under Archmage Hannibal Treven's reforms, and for that he was expelled. Vangaril, it seems, was cast out alongside him, perhaps for failing to report his friend quickly enough, perhaps simply for the company he kept. Whatever the reason, two men who had once belonged to something were suddenly outsiders, bound to each other by circumstance if nothing else. There's a particular kind of unfairness embedded in that detail, one the cave never explains outright, but that lingers over the whole story regardless. We have no record of Vangaril himself practicing necromancy. Based on what we know of how the Mages Guild generally operated under Traven's strict reforms, expulsion by association was hardly unheard of. Institutions being institutions, more interested in appearances of discipline than in carefully sorting genuine wrongdoing from simple proximity to it. If that's what happened here, then Vangaril lost his entire professional life, his standing, his community, for nothing more than refusing to abandon a friend at the exact moment abandoning him would have been easiest. Erendur did not stop. If anything, expulsion freed him to go further. The notes scattered through the cave, growing more disjointed the deeper you travel, suggest he found his way into the orbit of Manor, the king of worms himself, a name that in the world of Tamriel carries the same kind of dread that a plague carries in our own. Under that influence, Erendur did not simply continue practicing necromancy. He transformed himself entirely. He became a Lich, surrendering his living body to bind his soul into undeath, trading warmth and breath for power that does not fade with age. It's worth pausing here on what Manor actually represents within the wider tapestry of Tamrielic history, since his presence in these notes is never explained, but always implied to carry weight. Based on what we know from other corners of Elder Scrolls lore, Manor is not simply a powerful necromancer among many. He is, by most accounts, the very source from which much of the dark arts knowledge in Tamriel originally spread, an ancient and singular figure whose influence has touched the downfall of countless minor practitioners across centuries. For Erendur, a recently expelled mage searching for purpose and validation after losing everything he'd built within the Mages Guild, falling into contact with someone like that would have felt less like temptation and more like recognition, the promise that his expulsion wasn't an ending, but the beginning of something far older and far more significant than the institution that cast him out. This could imply that Erendur never saw his transformation as a fall at all, but rather as an ascension, a final escape from the smallness of guild politics into something that, in his own twisted understanding, must have felt like genuine power for the first time in his life. Vangaril watched this happen, or learned of it after the fact, and did the only thing his conscience would allow. He went to the Mages Guild and begged for help. He asked for battle mages, for resources, for anything that might let him save what remained of his friend before the transformation became permanent. This could imply that Vangaril, even at this point, still believed there was something left in Erendur worth saving, some fragment of the man who had once stood beside him. The guild refused him. Worse than refused, really. The notes suggest they used the moment to remind him of his own expulsion, to make clear that his concerns, however sincere, were no longer their concern. He had been cast out. His friend's fate was no longer the guild's business. There is a particular kind of bureaucratic cruelty embedded in that refusal that feels almost more chilling than anything Erendur himself does later in the story. A man comes to the very institution that trained him, warns them that one of their own former members has turned into something capable of true horror, and rather than treating this as the emergency it plainly was, the guild apparently chose instead to use the moment as an opportunity to reassert a boundary, to remind Vangaril precisely where he now stood in their eyes. Many players believe this detail, more than anything Erendur himself does. is the true moral failure buried inside this story. It would have cost the guild so little to send even a single battle mage to at least investigate the claim before dismissing it outright. Instead, their pride in their own rules became more important than the life of a man who only weeks earlier had been one of their own. And that small, petty refusal is arguably what sealed Vangaril's fate as surely as anything Erander did to him afterward. So Vangaril went alone. This is the part of the story the cave tells you, not through words, but through architecture, through the slow accumulation of detail as you walk deeper into the dark. You find alchemy equipment, novice grade, the kind a desperate man might bring along, hoping to brew something useful on the way. You find soul gems, empty, as though their contents were spent and never replaced. You find a silver dagger, the only kind of blade that does true damage to the undead, suggesting Vangaril came prepared, at least in theory, for what he might find waiting in the dark. There's a quiet heartbreak in cataloguing these objects one by one as you pass them. Each item a small fragment of a plan that clearly didn't survive contact with whatever Erander had become. The novice alchemy gear suggests a man who never expected to need true mastery, who perhaps believed a few simple potions might be enough to see him through. The empty soul gems suggest desperate improvisation somewhere along the way, magic spent and never replenished, because there was no time or no chance to gather more. Even the silver dagger, the one genuinely sound piece of preparation in the whole collection, speaks less of confidence than of someone trying to arm himself as best he could against something he likely understood. Even then, he was not truly equipped to face. You find letters, an open letter to the Guild of Mages, a letter for the once great Mages Council, an open threat to the Guild of Mages. These are not addressed to Vangaril. They are addressed by Erander, written in the voice of something that no longer entirely remembers being human, railing against the institution that abandoned him just as surely as it abandoned his friend. There is a particular cruelty in finding these letters scattered near where Vangaril must have read them himself, alone, in the dark, with nothing but a silver dagger and a friendship that was already lost. These letters reward a slower reading than most players are willing to give them on a first pass through the cave, since their tone shifts noticeably the further you progress, growing less coherent, more fragmented, as though whatever remained of Erander's original mind was steadily dissolving even as he composed them. The earliest letters, based on what we know of how the notes are arranged, read almost like a wounded man's grievance, articulate and bitter but still recognizably rational. By the final pages, the language has curdled into something closer to a threat than an argument. The guild no longer addressed as a former colleague might address it, but as an enemy to be punished, a target, rather than an audience. Many players believe this slow degradation, more than any single dramatic moment, is the cave's true horror, the patient documentation of a mind losing its grip, not all at once, but letter by letter, each one a little further from the man Vangaril once called his friend. The final note, the one that confirms what every careful reader already suspects by this point, states plainly that Erander intends to consume Vangaril from within, not kill him outright. Consume him. The two souls did not simply meet in combat and end in death. They merged, the Lich absorbing the spellsword's essence into its own undead form, creating something that is no longer two friends, but one entity, wearing both their names like a wound that never closed. If you press deeper into the cavern, past the chambers where necromancers and their risen dead still linger as though guarding something, you reach what the game calls Lost Boy's Hidden Bastion. And there, at the very end, you find Erender Vangaril, a lich. 2 souls fused into a single body. 2 intellects combined into something that may be more formidable and certainly more tragic than either man could have become alone. Here is where the story becomes almost unbearably strange, in a way that feels less like a bug and more like the game accidentally telling a deeper truth. Many players believe that if you encounter this lich before you have reached a certain level of strength and experience, specifically before level 23, he appears before you not as a threat, but as a harmless, intangible ghost. You cannot fight him. You cannot interact with him at all. He simply exists in front of you, fully formed, utterly untouchable, a memory wearing the shape of a man who can no longer be reached. There's something worth sitting with in just how passive that encounter feels compared to nearly everything else this cave has shown you up to that point. Every other room in Lost Boy Cavern asks something active of you, fighting through risen dead, navigating narrow passages, piecing together scattered notes. The ghost asks nothing at all. It simply stands there, indifferent to your presence in a way that feels almost crueler than outright hostility would. A monster that attacks you is at least acknowledging you exist. A ghost that drifts past you, unreachable and unbothered, suggests something far lonelier. That whatever remains of Erender Vangaril in this form is no longer even aware enough to recognize an intruder standing in front of him. And if that happens, if you meet him too early, that ghost is all you will ever get. Even if you return at level 23 or higher, even if you come back stronger, more prepared, with every silver weapon and protective spell available to you, he remains exactly as unreachable as he was the day you first saw him. The window does not reopen. The chance does not return. You are left permanently with a friend's ghost you cannot save, in the same way Vangaril was left with a friend he could not save either. A reading the game supports, even if it never says it outright, is that this is the entire point. The cave does not just tell you a story about a man who tried and failed to save his friend from a fate worse than death. It lets you experience that same failure yourself, mechanically, structurally, baked into the very bones of how the encounter works. If you arrive unprepared, you do not get a second chance. You simply have to live with having been there, having seen him, and having been powerless to do anything at all. When you do finally face him properly, at the right level, with the right gear, the fight itself is almost secondary to everything that came before it. You are not fighting a monster. You are fighting the last physical remnant of 2 friendships, 2 lives, 2 separate tragedies that became one, when a man who loved his friend too much to let the Mages Guild's politics stop him, walked alone into a cave from which he never returned. There's a particular weight to the silence that follows once the Lich finally falls, assuming you've arrived prepared enough to actually end the fight, rather than simply witness it. No triumphant fanfare greets you. No grateful spirit thanks you for finally granting release. The body simply collapses, 2 souls extinguished at once, and whatever loot the encounter yields feels, in that moment, almost beside the point. You came here for treasure, perhaps, or simple curiosity, and you leave instead having quietly closed the book on one of the saddest, most overlooked friendships in the entire game. A friendship that asked everything of one man and gave him in return nothing but a shared grave at the bottom of a cave nobody else ever bothered to explore. It's worth considering too how differently this story might read if the cave had given Vangaril a name we recognized from elsewhere in the game. Some tie to a larger faction, or a more prominent historical event. Instead, the developers chose to make him almost entirely anonymous, beyond what his own journal reveals. A spell sword, whose only documented act of significance was trying and failing to save a friend nobody else in Tamriel's wider history would ever think to remember. That anonymity feels deliberate. Vangeral's story does not need broader context to matter. It is complete entirely on its own terms, a small private tragedy that asks nothing of the player except the willingness to read a journal lying in the dirt and follow wherever its pages happen to lead. Most players who stumble onto Lost Boy Cavern do so purely by accident, drawn in by curiosity rather than any quest marker. And most of them never piece together the full story unless they happen to read every scattered page in the right order. The game gives you no journal entry, no quest tracker, no neat summary at the end. It simply trusts you to wander through a dead man's grief and decide for yourself what it means that loyalty, in the end, was the very thing that destroyed him. There's a particular kind of silence that follows you out of that cave once the fight is finished. Win or lose, ghost or lich, however your encounter happened to unfold. No music swells. No congratulatory message tells you what you've accomplished. You simply climb back up toward daylight, carrying whatever loot the cavern offered, and somewhere behind you, in the dark, two friends remain exactly as entangled in death as they apparently were in life, fused together forever in a body that belongs fully to neither of them. It is, in its quiet way, one of the loneliest endings the game has to offer, made all the lonelier by how easily it can be walked past entirely, by players who never think to climb down into a forgotten hole in the ground, simply because a strange journal happened to be lying outside it. The Curse of Benirus Manor. In the coastal town of Anvil, there is a rumor that drifts through conversation if you simply linger long enough among the townsfolk. A man named Velwyn Benirus, you'll hear, is looking to sell his grandfather's old manor house. Cheap. Suspiciously cheap, in fact, for the largest available property in town. 5,000 gold for a building that should, by every reasonable measure, cost far more. There's a particular flavor to how this rumor circulates through Anvil, distinct from the way most ordinary gossip travels through Cyrodiil cities. Townsfolk don't speak of the manor with the casual curiosity they might apply to any other property changing hands. They speak of it carefully, almost reluctantly, the way people speak of something they'd rather not draw attention toward, but feel obligated to mention anyway, perhaps out of some lingering sense of civic duty, to warn a stranger before that stranger makes a decision they might regret. Nobody outright says the house is haunted. Nobody needs to. The price alone tells you everything the townsfolk are too polite or too superstitious to say directly. Based on what we know of how rumors typically function elsewhere in the game, this hesitant, careful tone is itself a kind of clue. The collective unease of an entire town that has clearly absorbed, generation after generation, some half-remembered understanding that Benirus Manor is not a place to be purchased lightly. If you go looking for Velwyn, you'll usually find him at the Count's Arms, nursing a drink with the kind of weariness that doesn't come from simple fatigue. Talk to him long enough, and he'll offer you the deal. Benirus Manor, on the eastern edge of town, yours for 5,000 septims. He'll let you look at it first if you'd like. He seems almost eager for you to look at it first, in fact, though he never quite says why. There's a particular kind of tension worth noticing in how Velwyn carries himself during this exchange, if you pay close enough attention to the small details of his posture and tone. He is selling, technically, but he does not sell the way a man proud of his inheritance usually sells. He sells the way a man relieved to finally be rid of something sells, eager to close the transaction quickly, before you can ask too many questions about why his family's grand old manor has sat empty and unwanted for as long as anyone in Anvil can remember. There's something quietly tragic too, in imagining what it must have meant for Velwyn to inherit a house he was apparently never able to live in himself. A birthright that turned out to be more burden than blessing the moment he learned the truth his grandfather left hidden behind that sealed door. Many players believe the years he spent avoiding the property entirely, content to let it sit vacant rather than risk discovering what waited inside, says a great deal about a man who would rather lose an inheritance than face whatever consequences that inheritance carried. Selling it for a fraction of its true worth was not, in the end, a business decision at all. It was an act of quiet self-preservation, dressed up as an ordinary transaction so nobody, including Velwyn himself, would have to acknowledge what he was really doing. The manor itself, when you step inside, feels exactly like what it is. A once grand home that has fallen into disrepair. Faded rugs, a broken bookshelf, furniture that has clearly not been properly tended in longer than anyone alive can remember. It is, by Cyrodiilic standards, dingy, but it is large, and it is yours, and for 5,000 gold, dinginess seems like a reasonable trade. Walk through the foyer, and you'll notice the small details that suggest this was once a home people genuinely loved before something drove them out of it. A painting hangs above the fireplace, its colours dulled by years of neglected dust. A chest of drawers lies tipped onto its back in the corner, as though someone left in a hurry and never thought to write it again. Upstairs, a small study holds a desk and chair angled toward a window that no longer lets in much light, a tapestry above it gone grey with age. None of it announces danger outright. It simply feels the way certain houses do even before anything supernatural happens inside them, like a place that has been waiting, patiently, for someone to finally disturb whatever's been left undisturbed for far too long. The first night you sleep there, you understand why the price was so low. 3 ghosts, the Benirus Manor ghosts, tear into the room the moment you close your eyes, and unless you've come prepared with a silver weapon, an enchanted blade, or fist trained well enough in hand-to-hand to land supernatural damage, you may find yourself in serious trouble. These are not friendly spirits. They want you gone, or worse, and they will keep returning every single time you re-enter the house until the curse beneath it is finally lifted. Some players have noted that the manor becomes, almost accidentally, an unlimited source of ectoplasm for as long as the haunting continues, a grim little side effect of a much larger problem. It's worth pausing on just how disorienting that first encounter tends to feel, even for players who arrive expecting trouble. One moment, you're lying down in an unremarkable bedroom in a house you've just purchased with your own hard-earned gold. The next, 3 translucent figures are converging on you in the dark, moving with the kind of cold, purposeful hostility that suggests they have done this many times before to many people before you, and that the house's previous tenants likely did not all survive the experience to tell anyone about it afterward. It's worth considering too what kind of relationship these 3 ghosts might have once had to Lorgren Benirus himself, whether they were family members claimed by whatever ritual sealed his transformation, or simply unfortunate souls trapped within the house by the same curse that bound him. The game never names them individually, never gives them voices or histories of their own beyond their hostility, and that anonymity feels deliberate. 3 faceless extensions of whatever darkness Lorgren's curse left lingering in these halls, present purely to guard the secret sealed away in the basement below. After you fight them off and the dust settles, a jar crashes down from a cupboard on the ground floor. Inside the wreckage, you find two things: a skeletal hand and a torn page titled Scrap from Lorgren's diary. Both are necessary. Neither should be left behind, because once read, this note cannot be picked up again if you forget it, and once dropped, it is lost for good, unless you happen to store it safely in a container first. There's a small, almost cruel piece of game design tucked into that particular warning, the kind of detail that has frustrated more than a few players over the years. Most quest items in Oblivion forgive a degree of carelessness, remaining recoverable even after being dropped or misplaced. This particular diary scrap does not extend that same courtesy, and a moment's inattention can mean retracing your steps through an entire haunted manor simply to read 3 sentences a second time. It is a small reminder that this quest, gentle and quietly tragic as it is, still expects a degree of attentiveness from the player willing to see it through properly. The diary scrap reveals what every Anvil local already half suspected, without quite saying it aloud. The house is cursed, not metaphorically, genuinely, deliberately, magically cursed, by a man named Lorgren Benirus, Velwyn's own grandfather, who lived and apparently died inside these walls a very long time ago. This is where the quest takes its first real turn. You need to speak with Velwyn again, but he isn't in Anvil anymore. The townsfolk will tell you he's fled, and following the trail leads you all the way to the Imperial City, into the Elven Gardens district, where you'll eventually find him sitting inside the King and Queen Tavern, looking like a man trying very hard to disappear into his own drink. When you finally corner him there, and assuming his disposition toward you is high enough, he tells you the truth at last, the sordid details he clearly wishes he'd never had to share. He feels guilty, he says, for selling you the place. Guilty in the specific way that suggests he knew exactly what he was passing along to a stranger, and did it anyway, because some inheritances are simply too heavy to keep carrying alone. There's a particular kind of moral exhaustion visible in how Velwyn finally unburdens himself in that tavern, far from Anvil, far from the manor itself, as though distance alone made the confession possible, in a way it never could have been back home. Many players believe this detour to the Imperial City is not simply a quest mechanic designed to extend the adventure, but a deliberate choice meant to illustrate just how far Velwyn needed to run before he could finally speak plainly about what his family's house actually was. He did not flee Anvil out of practical necessity. He fled because he could no longer bear standing anywhere near that manor, while a stranger he'd sold it to slept inside it, waiting, presumably, to either survive the first night or not. His guilt is not abstract. It is specific, detailed. The guilt of a man who understood the danger and chose his own 5,000 gold over a clear warning. With the scrap of diary in hand, as proof of what you've learned, Velwyn agrees to return to the manor with you, though it's clear every step back through that door costs him something. Inside, more ghosts await, and you're free to fight through them or simply push past toward the basement, where Velwyn leads you to a sealed portal at the far end. He opens it, and then, the moment it's open, he runs. He does not look back. He does not wait to see what's inside. He simply flees the house entirely, leaving you alone with whatever his grandfather left sealed away in the dark. This particular detail, his refusal to even glance behind him, deserves more attention than most players give it on a first playthrough. Velwyn is not simply afraid of ghosts in the abstract. He has, presumably, grown up hearing stories about his own grandfather. Stories likely whispered rather than spoken plainly, the kind of family history that gets passed down in fragments and warnings rather than full explanations. Whatever he knows or suspects about what waits behind that sealed door, it is enough to override even basic curiosity, enough to send a grown man sprinting out of his own family's basement without so much as a backward glance at the stranger he's just led into danger. Many players believe Velwyn's flight is the single most honest moment in his entire arc, more honest than his earlier guilt, more honest than his careful selling of the house. Fear, unlike guilt, does not require a confession. It simply shows itself plainly, the moment the danger becomes real enough to outweigh whatever shame or obligation might otherwise have kept him standing there. Beyond the wall lies a hidden room, the kind of space that feels less like part of a house and more like a tomb someone built, and then quietly forgot to mention to their family. There's a valuable tome of unlife resting nearby. There's a sarcophagus holding old, leveled treasure, and in the center of it all stands Lorgren's altar, with Lorgren Benirus's own skeleton laid across the top of it, waiting. When you step inside the seal and touch the altar, a voice rises up from the bones themselves. It is calm. It is almost gentle. Lorgren speaks of wanting to make peace with the 9 divines at last, of wishing only to be made whole again so he might finally rest. All he asks, the voice says, is that you return his missing hand to his body. You have, of course, been carrying that hand the entire quest. Many players believe, based on how naturally the request lands after everything that's come before, that this is meant to feel like an act of mercy, a small kindness extended to a man who has clearly suffered some terrible, undefined fate. You touch the skeletal hand to his remains, expecting closure, expecting peace. There's a particular cruelty in how convincingly the game sets up this moment of full sentiment. Every detail leading up to it, the gentle voice, the talk of penance and peace with the divines, the simple, almost touching request, is engineered to make the obvious twist feel in the moment anything but obvious. You want to believe a tormented soul is finally being allowed to rest. You want the small kindness of returning a hand to a body to mean something tender. The game lets you believe that, right up until the instant it doesn't. What you get instead is a Lich. Lorgren Benirus rises from his own altar, very much undead, very much hostile, and very much amused by how easily you walked into his trap. There is no tragic backstory offered in this final moment. No sympathetic plea. Just an old, cunning thing that spent who knows how many decades waiting for someone foolish enough to hand over the one piece it needed to rise again. Scholars and long-time fans of the game have pointed out the story's striking resemblance to the case of Charles Dexter Ward, the H.P. Lovecraft tale of ancestral evil reawakened by a careless descendant, and the parallel feels almost too precise to be accidental. You kill him. You have to. And the moment his second death is final, the curse breaks completely. The lighting in the manor changes. The furniture restores itself. The grime and decay simply lift away, as though the house itself had been holding its breath for 100 years and only just now remembered how to exhale. There's something genuinely striking about how thoroughly the game commits to this transformation, treating it not as a simple flag flip, but as a complete visual rebirth of the entire property. Faded rugs brighten. Broken furniture mends itself. The dim, oppressive lighting that has defined every previous visit to this house lifts into something warmer, more welcoming, more like the home it presumably once was before Lorgren's curse settled over it generations ago. Many players who experience this transformation for the first time describe a genuine sense of relief upon walking back through the front door afterward, finding a completely different house waiting where the Haunted One used to stand. Proof that the curse was never simply a story told through dialogue, but something woven directly into the physical fabric of the building itself. If you carry word of this back to Chorrol, head of the Anvil Mages Guild, she'll thank you quietly for finishing a task she apparently set out to do herself long ago and never managed to complete. It's a small detail easily missed, but it suggests this curse was known, at least to some, long before Velwyn ever sold you that suspiciously cheap manor. Whether Chorrol herself is the very same person who first tried and failed against Lorgren, given how long an Altmer might live, is something the game leaves pleasantly, deliberately unclear, a small mystery resting quietly atop a much larger one. There's something fitting about ending this particular story on a note of ambiguity rather than certainty. Everything about Benirus Manor, from Velwyn's suspiciously cheap asking price to Lorgren's gentle, deceptive voice at the altar, has been built around the gap between appearance and truth, between what a thing seems to be and what it actually is underneath. Even the question of Chorrol's true age and history fits neatly into that same pattern. One final small mystery layered on top of a curse that has already taught you, rather thoroughly, not to trust the first explanation a house or a voice or a price tag offers you without question. The forgotten Hourglass of Rosethorn Hall. Skingrad is a city built into hillsides and vineyards, the kind of place where wealth has had time to settle into the architecture itself, and nowhere does that wealth show more plainly than in Rosethorn Hall, the largest house available for purchase anywhere in Cyrodiil. Buying it isn't cheap. 25,000 gold and a great deal of patience with Shumgroyarug, the orc butler, who has to be convinced you're worth the trouble before he'll even discuss a price. There's a quiet sense of arrival in finally completing that purchase, after weeks or months of adventuring spent accumulating enough fame and gold to be taken seriously by a butler who answers to account. Most players treat the moment as a culmination, the reward at the end of a long financial climb, a tangible symbol that their character has become someone of real standing in Cyrodiil. Few of them suspect, standing in their newly purchased foyer for the first time, that the house itself still has one more story left to tell them, one that has nothing to do with the Count or the butler or the gold it took to get here. Skingrad's own character as a city deserves a moment of attention here, since the wine country surrounding it has always lent the region a particular kind of old, settled wealth, distinct from the rougher frontier feeling of Bruma or the bustling commerce of the imperial city. Houses in this part of Cyrodiil carry a sense of permanence, built by families who clearly intended to stay for generations, and Rosethorn Hall fits neatly into that pattern. A grand old estate whose true age, once you discover the riddle hidden inside it, turns out to stretch back considerably further than most new owners would ever assume from its well-kept exterior alone. Most players who manage to scrape together the funds and earn enough fame to make the purchase consider that the end of the story. They furnish the house, room by room, spending even more gold on the 15 possible upgrades, and move on with their adventuring, never suspecting that somewhere inside their own newly purchased bedroom, something far older than them is waiting to be found. It sits in the loft above the stairs in the upper bedroom, tucked against the wall in a spot you would have no reason to look, unless you happen to glance up at exactly the right moment. A long-forgotten note, left behind by someone who never had the chance to come back for it. Reaching it is his own small trial. Without certain furniture upgrades purchased, getting up there at all requires a careful sequence of jumps, climbing onto a desk, then perhaps a deer head mounted on the wall, working your way up like a thief casing their own home. Some players have found you can wedge yourself into the corner where two walls meet and simply jump straight up from there, while others rely on a chain of furniture, a fireplace mantle here, a bookshelf there, each piece becoming an improvised foothold toward a 200-year-old secret. There's something quietly amusing about the physical comedy required to even begin this quest. In a game otherwise concerned with dragons and Daedric princes, and the closing of literal gates to Oblivion. Here you are instead, the supposed hero of Cyrodiil, awkwardly clambering across your own furniture like an overgrown house cat trying to reach the top of a bookshelf, all in pursuit of a single scrap of paper tucked into a corner no architect would ever reasonably design a room around. It is, in its own small way, a reminder that the developers were not above building entire secret quests around nothing more than a slightly inconvenient jump, trusting that the reward at the end would justify whatever indignity the climb required along the way. Once you finally have the note in hand and read it, the language is anything but a dry instruction manual. It is a letter, written in evident panic, from a man on the run from the city guard, addressed not to whoever might eventually find it, but to a lover he was forced to leave behind. He writes of a man named Delgarion, a rival he believes framed him for the very crime that sent him to prison in the Imperial City, warning his beloved to be wary of this man's affections and his motives. Rather than let the guards or Delgarion seize what he'd hidden, he tells her, he buried the treasure within the walls of Rosethorn Hall itself, and reminds her of a riddle the two of them once used as a private code while running through the house together as children. Two bodies have I, though both joined in one. The more I stand still, the quicker I run. There's a particular pleasure in how thoroughly this riddle resists the more modern instinct toward hand-holding, refusing even the smallest hint about where to begin searching once the answer itself has been worked out. Many players, having correctly puzzled through to the Hourglass, still spend considerable time afterwards simply wandering the house room by room, checking every shelf and cupboard, because the note never specifies which hourglass among potentially several scattered through a wealthy household happens to be the genuine treasure. The riddle made perfect sense to the two people who once shared Ilitiad as a private joke between childhood friends. It makes considerably less sense to a stranger who has to puzzle it out cold, searching a house full of decoys that were never placed there deliberately, simply furnished there because that is what wealthy houses tend to contain. There is something quietly remarkable about how patiently this entire quest waits for you. The note doesn't expire. The treasure doesn't move. Rosethorn Hall might sit empty in your ownership for 100 in-game days, furnished slowly across dozens of separate gold-spending trips to Gunda the Carpenter. And that hourglass will simply continue waiting in the dark of the basement, tucked into a pillar's frame, for however long it takes you to finally look up and notice the note above the stairs. Some players, by their own accounts, owned this house for entire playthroughs without ever discovering the loft existed at all, and only learned of the cache second-hand, long after the fact, wondering how many candlelit nights they'd spent sleeping just a few feet above a fugitive's last desperate letter to someone he clearly never saw again. It's worth noting, too, just how methodically the developers structured Rosethorn Hall's furnishing process around Gunda specifically, requiring a separate negotiation and payment for each individual upgrade, rather than allowing a single lump purchase to complete the house all at once. This deliberate slowness means most players experience their ownership of the house gradually, room by room, over what can amount to weeks of real-world playtime. Each visit adding another small piece of comfort to a space that started out as little more than an empty shell. The hidden hourglass, tucked away from the very beginning regardless of how furnished the surrounding rooms eventually become, sits as a kind of constant beneath all that gradual change, untouched by whichever decorating choices the player happens to make along the way. This could imply that whoever wrote that letter and the woman he addressed it to were connected to Rosethorn Hall in a far more personal way than any of the wealthy merchants and nobles who likely occupied it in the years since. The riddle itself is, based on what we know, a direct echo of a similar puzzle found all the way back in the original arena, the very first Elder Scrolls game, which suggests the developers buried a small piece of franchise history inside this single forgotten scrap of parchment, knowing full well that perhaps one player in 100 would ever stumble onto the connection. The answer, as long-time puzzle solvers will recognize immediately, is an hourglass, two bodies joined as one, the upper and lower chambers connected by a narrow neck of glass. The quicker it runs, the stiller it stands. It may be difficult to find as there is no real clue in the note as to where it exactly is, and several normal hourglasses scattered through the house in various desks may confuse anyone hunting for the genuine prize. The riddle gives you a category of object, not a location, leaving the search itself entirely up to your own willingness to wander a basement most owners furnish once and rarely think about again. There's a particular kind of stubbornness rewarded by this design choice, one that runs throughout much of Rosethorn Hall's larger quest line. The house itself is enormous, easily the largest purchasable property in the entire province, with rooms upon rooms of furniture upgrades to buy and place, each one slightly altering the texture of a space you might otherwise consider already complete. Searching that entire structure for a single hidden hourglass, with nothing more than a riddle for guidance, asks for a kind of patience that the game rarely demands elsewhere. Patience with your own home. Patience with the slow process of genuinely knowing a space, rather than simply passing through it. Down in the basement of Rosethorn Hall, among barrels of wine and crates of clutter, stands a wooden pillar with garlic hanging from its frame. An old precaution, perhaps, against vampires or worse things that might have once made a home here. Embedded directly into the top of that frame, easy to overlook entirely if you don't know to look, sits an old hourglass. There's something almost theatrical about how the basement presents this final piece, tucking the prize into the architecture itself, rather than placing it inside any ordinary container. You could walk past that pillar 100 times, fetching wine for a dinner party or storing away loot from your latest dungeon crawl, and never once think to examine the garlic hanging from its frame, let alone notice the small weathered hourglass nestled where wood meets wood above it. The treasure hides not behind a lock or a puzzle door, but simply in plain sight, disguised by the ordinary clutter of a basement nobody bothers to study closely. Activate it, and the quest resolves itself instantly. No combat, no further travel, just the quiet satisfaction of having solved a 200-year-old puzzle that the house's previous owner clearly intended for someone, eventually, to find. Your reward is the hourglass itself, along with the Ring of the Grey, and 6 flawless gems split evenly between diamonds, sapphires, and emeralds. A small fortune in stones for a riddle that fits on a single line. There's a particular satisfaction in how disproportionate this reward feels, relative to the effort required to earn it, especially once you understand the full scope of what's being offered. 6 flawless gems represent a meaningful sum even for a well-established adventurer, and the Ring of the Grey carries useful enchantments of its own, all of it handed over for nothing more than a moment of acrobatic climbing and a willingness to solve a riddle most players would simply skip past without a second thought. Many longtime fans of the franchise have pointed out that this generosity feels deliberate, a reward scaled not to the physical difficulty of the quest, but to the rarity of the curiosity required to even attempt it. The developers, it seems, wanted to reward exactly the kind of player who reads every note, examines every loft, and refuses to assume that a house holds nothing more than what its furniture upgrades advertise. It's worth dwelling too on the deliberate choice to borrow this riddle directly from Arena, the very first Elder Scrolls game, released over a decade before Oblivion itself. Many players believe this connection was placed here entirely for long-time series veterans, a small reward layered on top of an already small reward, recognizable only to those who happen to play through Tamriel's history from its earliest digital beginnings. There is something almost touching in that gesture, the idea that somewhere in Skingrad's wealthiest house, the developers tucked away a tiny piece of franchise continuity, fully aware that the vast majority of players would never recognize it, and content to let it remain an inside joke shared only between the game and whichever rare player happened to carry that specific piece of trivia into Cyrodiil with them. What lingers about this quest, more than the treasure itself, is the man who wrote that letter. Based on what the note itself tells us, he was a fugitive, fleeing a prison sentence in the Imperial City for a crime he insists he never committed, convinced that a rival named Delgarion had framed him out of jealousy over the woman he loved. He had grown up running through the halls of Rosethorn Hall, close enough to its eventual owner to share a private childhood riddle with her, the kind of code two people invent together long before either of them imagines it might someday matter. This could imply the woman he addressed the letter to either lived in or was closely connected to the house herself, since the riddle only makes sense as a message meant for her specifically. Whether he was ever caught again, whether he and his beloved were ever reunited, or whether Delgarion's jealousy won out in the end, the note never says. Many players believe the desperation in his handwriting, and the fact that the treasure was never recovered by either of them suggests his story did not end well. It's worth imagining too, just how many owners must have passed through Rosethorn Hall in whatever years separate that letter from the day you finally bought the place, never suspecting what waited quietly in their own basement. Wealthy merchants perhaps, or minor nobility, furnishing the house exactly as you yourself eventually would, hanging tapestries, stocking wine racks, hiring housekeepers, all while a frightened man's last letter to the woman he loved sat patiently above their stairs, utterly indifferent to who currently held the deed. Houses, it turns out, remember things their owners never do, and Rosethorn Hall kept this particular secret faithfully for far longer than its writer ever lived to reclaim it. The staff nobody wants. In Leowyn, down among the canal-laced streets near the southern edge of Cyrodiil, you might overhear townsfolk talking about strange noises coming from a particular house. Animal sounds, hissing, the kind of commotion that has neighbors politely, awkwardly, pretending not to notice. There's something fitting about Leowyn specifically serving as the backdrop for this small comedic disaster. A city built along waterways and canals that already carries a slightly damp, slightly chaotic atmosphere distinct from the more orderly streets of Cyrodiil's northern settlements. The neighbors' polite avoidance of the noise, rather than direct intervention or complaint, speaks to a particular kind of small-town discretion, The unspoken agreement that whatever odd commotion comes from inside a widow's house is, ultimately, her own business to sort out, regardless of how much hissing happens to be involved. The house belongs to Rosentia Galenus, an imperial widow with a hobby for collecting unusual examples of the arcane. Her late husband left her quite comfortable, by her own account, and she has spent her comfortable years gathering oddities and curiosities the way other people might collect porcelain figurines. Mostly, this hobby has been harmless. There's a quiet loneliness embedded in that description too, easy to overlook amid the comedy of everscamps and cursed staves. A widow, comfortable in wealth, but presumably less comfortable in company, filling her home with strange objects partly out of genuine fascination and partly, perhaps, simply to have something to fill the silence her husband once occupied. Her collection is not merely eccentric indulgence. It reads, on closer reflection, like the accumulated hobby of someone who has had a great deal of quiet time alone to develop it, one curious purchase at a time, never quite imagining that one of those purchases might eventually turn her own home into the talk of the town, for all the wrong reasons. This time it was not. Step inside her home, and you'll find her secluded, wandering the ground floor in a state of obvious distress, while 4 small Daedric creatures called everscamps skitter and hiss around the place, making exactly the kind of racket the neighbors have been complaining about. She'll explain, if you offer to help, that she recently purchased a Daedric staff for her collection, the way she's purchased dozens of strange items before, without quite realizing what she was bringing into her home. There's something worth knowing about everscamp specifically that adds an extra layer of dark comedy to this entire situation, based on what we know of how these particular Daedra function elsewhere in Tamrielic lore. Unlike ordinary scamps, which die normally and stay dead, everscamps are bound by their very nature to immediately respawn the instant they're killed, a kind of permanent loop of birth and death that makes them simultaneously harmless in raw combat power and nearly impossible to be rid of through violence. Rosentia's home, in other words, was never actually under threat of being overrun or destroyed by these creatures. She was simply doomed to share her living space with an endlessly regenerating population of small, screeching nuisances, for as long as that staff remained somewhere within her walls. A curse built less around danger and more around sheer, grinding inconvenience. The staff, it turns out, was never meant to simply sit on a shelf. Rosentia sends you to the Mages Guild to speak with her friend Alvis Uvenim, who delivers the harder truth. This is the staff of the Everscamp, an artifact born of one of Sheogorath's many jokes on mortal collectors. Whoever carries it gains a permanent entourage of scamps, summoned endlessly, impossible to be rid of through violence alone, since killing one only produces another in its place moments later, with no memory of having died at all. Worse, the staff itself carries a curse that drains the bearer's speed by a full 20 points the moment they accept it, a burden that cannot be lifted by any restoration spell or potion known in Tamriel. There's something worth noting in how casually Alves delivers this news, the way a Mages Guild member long accustomed to the strange whims of Daedric princes might simply shrug at one more artifact gone wrong. She does not seem alarmed by the prospect of Sheogorath's involvement, nor particularly sympathetic to Rosentia's plight, treating the whole situation with the practiced detachment of someone who has clearly fielded requests like this before. It is a small, telling detail about the Mages Guild's place in the world, an institution so frequently confronted with Daedric mischief, cursed artifacts, and minor catastrophes brought about by over-eager collectors that even a staff capable of permanently afflicting its bearer with an entourage of screeching imps barely registers as remarkable. It's worth sitting for a moment with just how ordinary Rosentia herself is in all of this. She is not a sorceress. She's not a treasure hunter chasing forbidden power. She is, by her own description, simply a comfortable widow with a fondness for unusual curiosities, the kind of person who might have bought this staff at auction, the same way she's bought dozens of other strange trinkets over the years, never once suspecting that this particular purchase came with 4 small, eternal, screeching companions attached. Her own home, once a place of quiet collecting, becomes instead a place she can barely stand to occupy, pacing the ground floor in evident misery, waiting for a stranger brave enough to take her problem off her hands. There are, Alves explains, only 2 ways to be free of it. Find someone else foolish or kind enough to willingly accept the staff in your place, or return it to where it came from, an old, forgotten shrine to Sheogorath, buried deep inside Dark Fathom Cave, just east of the city. When you return to Rosentia and agree to take the staff from her, you feel the curse settle onto you immediately. Your movements slow. 4 scamps appear at your heels, chattering and shrieking, and they will not leave your side until the curse is broken, following you everywhere. Even, many players have noted, with some amusement, into combat against far more dangerous creatures, where they tend to crowd in close enough to occasionally block incoming attacks meant for you. There's a particular irony in how the Everscamps occasionally end up functioning as accidental allies during this whole ordeal, their constant presence sometimes proving useful in unexpected combat situations despite being, by every other measure, an unwanted curse rather than a deliberate boon. A bandit's arrow meant for you might instead find one of the scamps crowding at your heels, which simply respawns moments later regardless, meaning the curse occasionally protects you from the very dangers it makes you more vulnerable to elsewhere. It is a small, almost accidental piece of balance, the kind of emergent gameplay quirk that probably wasn't deliberately designed, but that nonetheless adds an extra layer of dark comedy to an already comedic curse. There's a particular comedy to walking through the streets of Leowyn, trailing 4 small, hissing Daedra behind you, watching ordinary townsfolk react with confusion or alarm as you pass, your own movements slow to something closer to a careful trudge than a confident stride. The curse does not announce itself with any dramatic visual flourish. It simply makes you, for as long as you carry that staff, slightly ridiculous, slightly pathetic, a hero of Cyrodiil reduced to shuffling along with a tiny entourage of shrieking imps that even the locals seem to find more amusing than threatening. Darkfathom Cave itself is small as far as Cyrodiilic dungeons go, but it is populated by level-scale Daedra that take the threat of trespassers seriously, and the speed penalty from the staff makes every encounter inside feel slightly more dangerous than it should. Many experienced adventurers choose to clear the cave entirely before ever accepting the staff from Rosentia in the first place, slipping in unburdened, killing everything that might oppose them, and only then returning to collect the cursed item, knowing the path back will be empty and the curse's effects will matter far less. There's a particular irony in how much strategic planning this otherwise comedic quest actually rewards, the kind of careful sequencing more often associated with serious dungeon delves than with a quest centered on an annoying staff and 4 squeaking imps. Clearing the cave beforehand transforms what could be a genuinely difficult slog, slowed and harassed the entire way by scamps that block your retreat and disrupt your aim, into a simple, almost leisurely walk to drop off an item nobody wants. It speaks to something the developers clearly understood about player psychology, that even the silliest Daedric curse becomes tolerable, even enjoyable, once the player has found a clever workaround that lets them feel a step ahead of Sheogorath's joke, rather than simply suffering through it. At the very end of the cave waits an old shrine to Sheogorath, the Daedric Prince of Madness, forgotten by most of Tamriel, but apparently still capable of working its mischief on anyone careless enough to stumble into its reach. The moment you arrive, a message tells you plainly that you no longer feel the urge to carry the staff. Drop it near the altar, and the curse releases its grip entirely. The scamps stop following. Your speed returns. The whole ordeal simply ends, as suddenly and strangely as it began. Return to Rosentia, and she rewards you with the Ring of Eidolon's Edge, along with her genuine gratitude, the kind that comes from someone who has clearly learned a hard lesson about the dangers of collecting things she does not fully understand. There's a small, quiet coda worth noting in how Rosentia carries herself once the ordeal finally ends, the relief evident in even her smallest gestures around the home she can finally enjoy again, without 4 shrieking companions trailing through every room. She does not announce any newfound caution about her collecting habits, nor does the game suggest she's learned to be more careful going forward. If anything, the implication seems to be that she'll likely repeat this same mistake again someday, drawn back into her hobby the moment enough time has passed to dull the memory of this particular catastrophe, which feels, in its own small way, like an honest piece of characterization. People rarely learn permanent lessons from temporary inconveniences, however miserable those inconveniences happen to be. While they lasted, what makes this particular questline worth remembering, beyond the simple comedy of being trailed by hissing little Daedra through a cave, is what it reveals about Sheogorath's particular sense of humor. This is a Daedric prince capable of reshaping entire realms, of granting power beyond mortal comprehension. And what he chose to do with this staff was simply this: give an ordinary widow in Leowyn a permanent infestation of small, screeching demons, purely for the entertainment value of watching her struggle to find someone willing to take the joke off her hands. Many players believe this is precisely the point. Not every Daedric curse needs to be apocalyptic. Sometimes the cruelest jokes are the smallest ones, the kind that simply make your life mildly, relentlessly inconvenient, until someone finally agrees to suffer through it on your behalf. It's worth lingering too on the strange afterlife this staff continues to enjoy in the world, even once Rosentia's own ordeal has ended. Long after the quest concludes, the cave it once called home remains a quietly popular destination for adventurers in need of easy, low-stakes combat practice, since the Everscamps respawn endlessly and carry no real threat beyond their numbers. Sheogorath's joke, in other words, outlives the very punchline it was built around, becoming a kind of permanent, low-grade attraction tucked into the wilderness east of Leowyn, a Daedric curse slowly repurposed by mortal adventurers into something almost like a training ground, which feels, in its own roundabout way, like precisely the sort of irony the Prince of Madness would have appreciated most. The sword that points the way. Northwest of the Imperial City, tucked into the quiet stretches of the great forest between the capital and Chorrol, there is a ruin called Fort Coldcorn. It holds no marked quest. No NPC sends you there. It exists simply as one of hundreds of forgotten ruins scattered across Cyrodiil, the kind most players ride past without a second glance, assuming reasonably that it holds nothing but bandits and old rubble. There's something worth noting about just how unremarkable Fort Coldcorn appears compared to many of the game's other ruined forts. the ones with sprawling underground complexes or notable history attached to their stonework. Coldcorn offers none of that grandeur. It is simply old stone, weathered by time, scattered among trees that have clearly grown undisturbed for decades around its broken walls. Based on what we know of how Cyrodiil's many ruins were designed, most exist purely as combat encounters. Small dungeons meant to test a low-level adventurer's skill against a handful of bandits or wild creatures. Fort Coldcorn looks, from the outside, exactly like one of these unremarkable encounters, which makes the secret hidden along its eastern wall all the more rewarding for whoever happens to notice it. The Great Forest itself, stretching between the Imperial City and Chorrol, has always carried a particular density in its layout. Dozens of small ruins and landmarks scattered close enough together that most players moving quickly between major cities simply ride straight through without registering most of what lies just off the road. Fort Coldcorn sits exactly in that kind of overlooked space, close enough to well-travelled paths that thousands of characters have presumably passed within sight of it, and obscure enough that only a small fraction of those characters ever bothered to actually stop and explore its walls. If you happen to explore its eastern wall, though, you'll find a chest resting on a high ledge, the sort of placement that suggests someone wanted it found, but only by those curious enough to actually climb and look. Inside waits a scattering of ordinary loot, alongside two items that matter far more than their humble appearance suggests: a key of hidden wealth and a folded note. Beside the chest, resting on the ground, lies a fine steel longsword. The note beside it instructs you, in language too playful to be anything but a deliberate game, that the sword leads the way half a mile, just past the big rock on the right. There's something worth appreciating in just how confident this note is in its own cleverness, written in a tone that practically winks at whoever happens to read it. The author, whoever they were, clearly enjoyed constructing this small puzzle, treating the half-mile walk and the pointing sword not as an obstacle meant to frustrate, but as a game meant to delight. A tiny scavenger hunt tucked into an otherwise unremarkable corner of the Great Forest. It is hard not to picture the developers themselves taking a particular pleasure in building this sequence, knowing full well that the vast majority of players would never see it, content to let it exist purely for the handful who would. There is a particular kind of stillness to ruins like Fort Coldcorn, the sort that settles over any old fortification, long since abandoned by whatever soldiers or bandits once called it home. Wind moves through broken archways. Grass grows up through old stonework. Nothing about the place suggests a treasure hunt is waiting to begin, which is precisely why so few players ever bother climbing that eastern wall in the first place. They see a forgotten fort, assume correctly that it holds nothing but old stone and the occasional skeleton, and ride on toward whatever quest marker is currently glowing on their compass. The chest never asks for attention. It simply waits, the way every secret in this story seems content to wait, for someone curious enough to look up instead of through. This is where the quest becomes, quite literally, an exercise in following directions left by someone who clearly delighted in being clever rather than clear. The blade itself, many players have noticed, points in a specific direction, northeast, and the game expects you to take that pointing seriously, to walk roughly half a mile in the exact direction the sword's tip indicates, scanning the landscape to your right as you go. There's something almost meditative about that walk, if you allow yourself to take it slowly, rather than fast traveling past the experience entirely. Half a mile through the Great Forest, sword in hand, eyes scanning the tree line for a landmark you've never seen and couldn't possibly recognize on sight. The forest here is quiet in the particular way Cyrodiil's wilderness so often is. Dense canopy filtering the light into soft, shifting patterns across the undergrowth. The occasional distant cry of some creature you'll never actually encounter. It is the kind of walk that asks nothing of your combat skills and everything of your patience. A small test of whether you're willing to trust a dead stranger's cryptic note over the more familiar comfort of a glowing compass marker. The walk takes you past Glademist Cave, into a stretch of land scattered with large rock formations, exactly the kind of terrain where finding one specific rock among many should be nearly impossible. But the note was precise in his own strange way. You're looking for a large rock perched on a steep slope, with a smaller rock tucked beside it, and nestled low between the two, half swallowed by grass, sits a second chest. There's a particular satisfaction in finally spotting that second chest after a long stretch of uncertain wandering. The moment when a half-mile of careful, patient walking finally resolves into something concrete and findable. Many players describe a small jolt of validation in that moment, proof that the dead stranger's note really was accurate after all, that 2 centuries of weather and overgrowth hadn't erased the landmarks beyond recognition. It is a small but genuine reward in itself, separate entirely from whatever loot the chest eventually yields. The simple confirmation that careful attention and patience were rewarded exactly as promised. This one is locked, and it can only be opened with the key of hidden wealth you picked up back at Fort Coldcorn. Inside waits a level dagger, scaled to whatever your character's level happened to be at the moment the chest's contents were generated, which means returning here at level 6 might earn you a humble iron dagger, while returning at the right window of higher levels could net something considerably more dangerous, like a silver dagger capable of harming the undead, or rarer still, an enchanted blade. There's a particular quirk worth knowing about how this leveled reward actually generates, one that has frustrated careful players for years. Based on what long-time documentation suggests, the dagger's quality is determined not necessarily by your level at the moment you open the final chest, but potentially by your level when you first entered the surrounding area, meaning a character who happened to wander near Fort Coldcorn or its neighbouring landmarks early in their adventures, long before ever finding the note, might return decades of in-game time later only to discover the treasure has already been determined by a version of themselves who is far weaker and far less deserving of a worthwhile reward. It's a small, almost mischievous bit of game design, a reminder that even a quest built entirely around patient curiosity can still contain a quietly cruel technical surprise waiting at the very end for the unlucky few who triggered it too early without ever realizing they had. Alongside the dagger sits one final note, a quiet closing line to a story that never had a name, never had a journal entry, never had so much as a single line of recorded dialogue from a single living character. The construction said itself, the very tool the developers used to build the game, labels this entire sequence internally as an Easter egg, which tells you something important. This wasn't meant to be a quest in the traditional sense at all. It was meant to be a secret, a small private joke left by the development team for the rare player patient, enough to climb a forgotten wall, read a cryptic note, and trust a sword pointing into the wilderness. There's a particular generosity hidden in that internal classification, a quiet acknowledgement from the developers themselves that not every piece of content they built needed to serve the larger structure of quests and journal entries the rest of the game relies on so heavily. Sometimes, apparently, It was enough simply to hide something clever in the wilderness and trust that somewhere, eventually, a player curious enough would stumble across it and feel the small thrill of discovery the team clearly hoped to provide. Many longtime fans consider sequences like this one among the purest expressions of what made Oblivion's world feel genuinely alive, content that existed for no reason beyond the simple pleasure of being found. There is no character to thank you, no reward beyond the dagger itself and the quiet satisfaction of having solved something nobody asked you to solve. Many players believe this is precisely what makes the unbeaten path worth remembering among the dozens of similar hidden treasures scattered through Cyrodiil. It asks for nothing but curiosity, and it gives back nothing but the simple, old-fashioned pleasure of a puzzle solved entirely on its own terms, far from any city, any guild, any voice at all. There's something quietly poignant too in how little this treasure cares about who finds it. It does not scale dramatically to reward only high-level adventurers, nor does it gatekeep itself behind any particular skill or quest prerequisite. A new character wandering the great forest in their very first hours of play could stumble onto this same chest, this same longsword, this same half-mile walk toward a rock they've never seen before, and the experience would unfold exactly the same way it would for a character who has already toppled empires and closed 100 Oblivion gates. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the most democratic secrets in the entire game, equally available to anyone patient enough to climb a wall and read a note, regardless of how far along their own larger story has travelled. Two lonely hearts in Chorrol. Chorrol is a city of timber and stone, nestled against the edge of the great forest, and like every city in Cyrodiil, it has its share of residents going quietly about their lives, mostly unremarked upon, mostly unremembered by the players who pass through chasing larger quests. Two of those residents, based on what nearly everyone in town seems to privately believe, deserve far better company than the loneliness they've settled into. There's something particularly fitting about this small romance unfolding in Chorrol specifically, a city whose architecture and atmosphere have always carried a slightly more domestic, settled feeling than the grander, more political cities like the Imperial City or Skingrad. Chorrol feels like a place where ordinary lives are lived quietly, where a guard captain and an innkeeper might pass each other on the street for years without ever quite finding the occasion to speak, simply because neither the city nor its rhythms ever force the issue. It takes an outsider, a stranger passing through with no investment in local hierarchies of class or profession, to finally nudge two people together, who the entire town apparently already suspected belonged with each other. Chorrol's reputation throughout the rest of the game leans heavily on its association with the Fighters Guild, and a generally practical, working-class character, distinct from wealthier cities further south. That practicality extends, it seems, even into matters of the heart, where romance unfolds not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through small, accumulated kindnesses. Pumpkin bread offered quietly across a bar, an evening visit kept faithfully at the same hour, day after day. It is courtship scaled to the city's own unassuming character, modest and steady rather than sweeping. The story begins, fittingly enough, with a romance novelist. Casta Scribonia is well known throughout Chorrol for her romantic stories, the kind of author whose books fill the shelves of half the city's libraries, and it turns out her gift for matchmaking extends well beyond the page. Ask her about the town, and she'll tell you, almost conspiratorially, about two lonely existences living right under everyone's nose, a guard captain and the proprietor of the local inn. She believes they would make a perfect couple. She will not, however, tell you their names outright, content instead to let you piece the puzzle together yourself, the same way a reader might piece together the ending of one of her own novels. There's something worth appreciating in just how deliberately Casta withholds the names, treating her own neighbors' love lives with the same narrative instinct she presumably applies to whatever romances she's currently writing for publication. She does not simply hand you a solution. She constructs a small mystery instead. Confident enough in her own perceptiveness about the town's hidden loneliness that she's willing to let a complete stranger do the legwork of confirming what she already suspects. It is, in its own quiet way, a writer's habit bleeding into real life, the instinct to let a story unfold naturally, rather than simply summarizing its ending before anyone has had the chance to live it. The guard captain in question is Bitnell the Cursebringer, a Nord who clearly takes pride in his work, patrolling the streets of Chorrol with the steady discipline of a career soldier. Ask him about the town, though, and a different side of him emerges. He'll complain, with the particular bitterness of a man who has given up expecting otherwise, that the women of Chorrol are all, in his words, kind of snooty. Good-looking, certainly, but cold, unapproachable, not very nice at all. There's a small, almost endearing contradiction at the heart of Bitnell's character that becomes clear the longer you spend listening to him. He clearly wants companionship. He clearly notices the absence of it in his life, enough that the subject comes up unprompted in casual conversation with a complete stranger. And yet his framing of the problem places the fault entirely outside himself. The women of his town being uniformly unkind, rather than any possibility that he himself, in his rigid pride as captain of the guard, has simply never given anyone the chance to prove him wrong. There's a quiet sadness too, in imagining how many years this particular pattern has likely repeated itself for Bitneld, patrolling the same streets day after day, year after year, convinced of his own correctness about the women of his city, while never once testing that conviction against actual conversation. Loneliness has a way of calcifying into certainty if left undisturbed long enough, transforming a simple absence of connection into a fully formed worldview about why that connection has never come. Bitneld's bitterness is not malicious. It is simply tired, the accumulated residue of a man who stopped trying long before he ever admitted to himself that he had. The innkeeper is Emfried, who runs the Grey Mare with the quiet competence of someone who has spent years learning exactly how to keep a tavern running without complaint. Ask her about Bitneld specifically, and her tone shifts instantly into something warmer. She thinks he seems like such a nice fellow, she'll tell you. It's a shame, really, that she doesn't see him in her inn more often. There's a quiet dignity in how Emfried carries her own loneliness, distinct from Bitnell's more openly bitter complaints about the women of Chorrol. She does not blame him for his absence, nor does she construct elaborate theories about why he prefers the oak and crozier to her own establishment. She simply notices his absence, names it plainly when asked, and continues running her inn with the same steady competence she presumably brings to every other aspect of her work. It is a smaller, gentler kind of patience than Bitneld's, less defensive, more accepting, and it makes her eventual happiness, once the two finally do connect, feel like something genuinely earned rather than merely arranged. Here is the small tragedy hiding underneath this otherwise light-hearted little quest. These two people, separated by nothing more than a few city blocks and a handful of unspoken assumptions, have apparently never had a real conversation. Bitnell doesn't even drink at the Grey Mare. As a captain, he tells you, almost without thinking about how it sounds, He frequents the oak enclosure instead, because the oak caters to what he calls a better class of people, while the grey mare, in his estimation, serves only others. It's a small, almost throwaway line, but based on what we know of how Oblivion's dialogue systems generally work, it carries more weight than its brevity suggests. Bitneld has built an entire imagined hierarchy of worth around something as simple as which tavern a person chooses to drink in, and he has done so without ever once setting foot in the place he's judging, without ever speaking to the woman who runs it, without any evidence at all beyond his own assumptions about what kind of people belong where. Emfrid, for her part, has built her own quiet fondness for him entirely from a distance too, admiring a man she barely knows from behind her bar, never quite working up the nerve, or perhaps never finding the right occasion to invite him in herself. Two lonely people, each one waiting for the other to make the first move. Neither of them seems capable of making alone. If you return to Bitneld and raise the subject of Emfrid specifically, something shifts in him mid-sentence. He starts to explain his reasoning, his preference for finer company, and then stops himself, almost audibly catching the snobbery in his own words. He sounds, he realizes aloud, exactly like the very women he's been complaining about all along. Snooty. Not very nice. The exact same coldness he spent so long resenting in others, he discovers, has been quietly living inside him the entire time. It is a small human moment of self-awareness, rare enough in any video game NPC that it's worth pausing on. He decides, on the spot, to visit the Grey Mare and pay his respects to this Emfrid woman he's never properly met. There's a particular grace in how quickly Bitneld pivots once he recognizes his own hypocrisy. None of the defensive backpedaling or excuse-making that so often follows when someone is confronted with an uncomfortable truth about themselves. He simply admits it, plainly, and acts on the realization immediately rather than retreating into wounded pride. Many players believe this small character beat, easily missed in a quest most walk straight past, represents one of the more genuinely mature moments of self-correction anywhere in the game. A captain of the guard who has spent years patrolling a city's streets finally turning that same scrutiny inward, if only for a moment, and not flinching from what he finds there. From that point forward, should you happen to return to Chorrol in the evenings, you'll find Bitneld at the Grey Mare every single day at 6 in the evening, spending 4 full hours in Emfrid's company before returning to his duties. She, in turn, begins offering him small kindnesses he clearly never expected. Pumpkin bread to keep up his strength on long night watches, mead set aside because she remembers that he likes it. The quiet accumulation of small gestures that make up most real affection, long before anyone calls it love out loud. Speaking with Casta Scribonia again afterward reveals she's heard the rumours already, that the town's 2 lonely hearts have started spending their evenings together, and her pleasure at having engineered the whole thing, even indirectly, through a stranger she sent digging for gossip, is evident in every word. There's a particular satisfaction Casta seems to take in this outcome that goes beyond simple gossip, something closer to artistic pride, the satisfaction of a storyteller who has finally watched one of her own carefully imagined romances play out in real life rather than merely on the page. It is easy to imagine her filing this small success away as inspiration for whatever novel she happens to be drafting next. The real Chorrol providing material every bit as compelling as anything she could have invented herself. Many players believe this small detail rounds out her character nicely, suggesting that her gift for romantic storytelling was never purely fictional to begin with, but rooted instead in a genuine, perceptive understanding of the people living around her. What's worth knowing, for anyone hoping to actually witness this small romance unfold, is that the quest depends heavily on dialogue threads that, based on what we know from years of player documentation, simply don't trigger correctly without certain fixes applied, jumping instead straight from Bitnell's complaints to Emfrid's gratitude with nothing in between. The entire courtship compressed into a single conversational blink. When everything functions as intended, though, what you're left with is one of the gentlest, quietest stories in the entire game. No dungeon, no combat, no reward beyond watching two people who clearly only needed someone, anyone, willing to nudge them gently in each other's direction, finally find their way to a shared table at 6 o'clock every evening, for as long as either of them remains alive to keep the appointment. There's something worth treasuring in how small this entire questline chooses to stay, in a game otherwise filled with prophecies and Daedric princes, and the literal closing of gates to Oblivion. Nobody's soul is at stake here. No artifact needs recovering. The entire arc of the story is simply two people learning to see each other clearly for the first time, nudged along by a romance novelist's gossip and a stranger's idle curiosity. It is easy to imagine the developers tucking this quest away almost as a private gift to careful players. A reminder that not every story in Cyrodiil needs higher stakes than two lonely people finally noticing each other across a tavern they'd both walked past for years. The Akaviri Madstone and the Thief's Forgotten Ring, high in the Chorrol Mountains, beyond a path that does not even exist on your map until a particular quest is underway, lies Pale Pass, a secluded valley connecting Cyrodiil to the frozen reaches of Skyrim. It was once, based on what we know of its history, the secret command post of an ancient Akaviri invasion, and the fort built into its valley still holds remnants of that long-forgotten campaign. There is a particular kind of cold that settles over this entire region, the sort that the game communicates as much through silence as through any visual snowfall. Few birds, no wandering wildlife of the ordinary sort, just wind and ice, and the long, slow accumulation of centuries pressing down on stone that nobody has properly maintained since the Akaviri themselves vanished from these mountains. Most players who eventually find their way here are focused entirely on the Countess's errand, moving with purpose toward whatever artifact awaits, never suspecting that the valley itself is holding a second, smaller, far lonelier story tucked into its frozen corners. The path to Pale Pass opens only after Countess Narina Carvain of Bruma. Once your fame has grown enough for her steward Tolgan to take notice of you, asks for help recovering an artifact called the Draconian Madstone. She explains that she possesses the diary of a long-dead Akaviri messenger, complete with sketched maps and landmarks, the last known trail leading toward where the Madstone disappeared centuries ago. There's a particular character study worth lingering on in Countess Carvain's evident passion for these recovered artifacts. A collection that, based on what the surrounding dialogue suggests, has clearly become something close to a personal obsession, rather than a simple matter of civic pride. Bruma itself sits at the very edge of Cyrodiil's northern frontier, closer to the wilderness and the mountains than nearly any other city in the province. And there is something fitting about a countess ruling from that particular vantage point, developing such a deep fascination with the ancient Akaviri presence that once passed through these same frozen peaks centuries before her own family ever claimed the throne. Her interest is not merely scholarly. It carries the weight of someone trying, perhaps, to understand the deep history of the land she now governs, piecing together fragments of an empire that vanished long before recorded memory could properly capture it. Bruma's own relationship to its mountainous, frontier surroundings only deepens this sense of the Countess as a custodian of frozen history, rather than simply a ruler concerned with ordinary governance. Snow falls there nearly year-round. The city itself sits closer to the border with Skyrim than to the warmer, more fertile lands further south, and that proximity to wilderness and old, half-forgotten campaigns seems to have shaped Carvain's particular fascinations in a way that wouldn't quite make sense for a countess governing somewhere like Anvil or Leowin. Her interest in the Madstone, in other words, feels rooted in her city's own character as much as in her own personal curiosity. Following that diary takes you through landmarks with a kind of poetic specificity only an old, careful record could provide. Dragonclaw rock, shaped, fittingly, like a giant lizard's foot. A towering statue called the Sentinel, standing watch over a path few have walked in generations. Eventually, the trail leads you to the Serpent's Trail, a hidden passage that opens into Pale Pass itself, the valley both frozen and forgotten, holding secrets that have waited centuries for someone patient enough to come looking. There's a particular pleasure in following a trail built from physical landmarks rather than glowing compass markers, even in a game otherwise generous with its guidance. Each landmark feels earned the moment you find it, a giant stone foot rising unexpectedly from the landscape, a weathered statue standing sentinel over nothing in particular except the empty mountain air. Each one a small confirmation that the centuries-old diary in your hands was written by someone who genuinely walked this exact path themselves, leaving behind directions precise enough to still function flawlessly after all this time. Inside the ruined fort, you eventually face down an Akaviri commander named Mishaxi, recovering the Madstone from the chamber behind him, and returning it to Countess Carvain earns you a fine reward and a small mention in the next edition of the Black Horse Courier. Most players, having recovered the artifact, consider the matter closed and move on. There's a particular weight to standing in that final chamber, facing down a commander who has presumably guarded this same post for far longer than any mortal soldier reasonably could. A remnant of an invasion force that vanished from Tamriel's history books generations ago. Mishaxi's continued presence here raises questions the quest never quite answers. Whether he is undead, bound by some lingering magic, or simply the last living vestige of a campaign nobody else remembers waging. The fight itself is straightforward enough, but the strangeness of his continued existence lingers afterward. A small unanswered mystery layered beneath the larger mystery of the Madstone itself. There's something quietly satisfying about how thoroughly the Akaviri half of this story commits to its own grandeur, treating the recovery of a single ancient artifact as significant enough to warrant a published news article read across the entire province, while the thief's lonely treasure hunt buried in the very same valley receives no such recognition at all. One story is loud, official, recorded for posterity in print. The other survives only in a crumpled note found inside a frozen barrel, unread by anyone except whichever adventurer happens to stumble across it centuries later. Pale Pass, in this sense, holds two entirely different scales of memory within the very same frozen stones. One preserved by history, the other preserved only by chance. But Pale Pass holds a second secret, one that has nothing to do with Countess Carvain's collection at all, and everything to do with a thief who passed through this same frozen valley long before you and met an end nobody recorded. Hidden among the ruins, separate entirely from the Akaviri quest, lies a frozen barrel embedded in ice near the westernmost tower. Inside you'll find a rusty key and a crumpled note written by someone identified only by the initials GS, a thief whose full name has been lost entirely to time. The note explains, in the practical, slightly anxious tone of someone hiding something valuable in dangerous territory, that he has hidden a magical ring somewhere in this fort and left behind a trail of clues to find it again. There's a particular intimacy in encountering someone reduced entirely to initials, a thief whose full identity the centuries have simply worn away, leaving behind only the barest fragment of who he once was. Most named characters in Oblivion carry at least a surname, a hometown, some small biographical detail that anchors them within the wider world. GS has none of that. He exists purely as a set of initials and a single anxious note, a person almost entirely erased by time, except for the one careful act of hiding something he valued enough to leave instructions for retrieving it later. Many players believe this anonymity is precisely what makes his small story land as hard as it does. The universal shape of someone trying to protect something precious in a dangerous, indifferent world, stripped of every detail except the fear and the hope embedded in his own handwriting. Whether he ever returned for that ring himself, the game never says. Many players believe he did not. Pale Pass, after all, is not a place that forgives carelessness, frozen and remote as it is, patrolled by ogres and the restless dead long after the original Akaviri campaign that built this fort was forgotten. The ogres and undead Akaviri soldiers that patrol these ruins deserve their own brief mention, since they add a particular texture to the danger of simply lingering here long enough to search for a thief's hidden treasure rather than rushing straight toward the Madstone itself. Unlike the more mundane bandits and wildlife scattered through most of Cyrodiil's other ruins, these guardians feel genuinely tied to the valley's ancient history, the lingering remnants of an Akaviri garrison that never truly left. Searching for GS's hidden ring means accepting a slower, more exposed pace through territory that punishes carelessness, a fitting price, in its own way, for treasure that has waited this long to be found. Following his trail means searching out a hidden chest inside the westernmost tower itself, buried partially in dirt and disguised by grass, which yields an old key. That key opens another container elsewhere in the ruins, which yields yet another key, each step requiring careful searching of a valley that offers no quest markers, no compass arrows, nothing but the thief's own handwritten directions to guide you. There's a particular rhythm to this kind of treasure hunting that rewards a different sort of patience than most of the game's combat-driven content ever asks for. Each container you find offers no certainty that you're on the right track beyond your own careful reading of the thief's note, no glowing marker confirming progress, no journal entry ticking off another completed objective. You are, in effect, trusting a dead man's handwriting over centuries of weathering and decay, hoping the landmarks he describes still resemble themselves closely enough to be recognized by someone who never knew this valley before today. Many players have noted that this kind of treasure hunt feels closer to genuine archaeology than anything else the game offers, a slow, deliberate process of trust and verification, rather than the usual rhythm of combat and reward that defines so much of Cyrodiil's other content. The final reward, found in a forgotten chest tucked against the rocky wall near the entrance, is the Circlet of Omnipotence, a ring that fortifies nearly every attribute a character possesses, a treasure significant enough that an unlucky thief might well have died trying to keep it safe, or died trying to retrieve it, or simply died of the cold before he ever got the chance to come back at all. What lingers about this hidden hunt, layered quietly beneath the grander Akaviri history of the Madstone and Countess Carvane's collection, is the contrast between the two stories occupying the very same valley. One is a tale of empires, ancient invasions, lost artifacts recovered for the benefit of nobility. The other is the story of one anonymous man, known only by two initials, who found something precious in a frozen ruin, hid it carefully enough to leave a trail rather than risk losing it outright, and then, based on what little evidence remains, never came back to claim it. Two treasures, hidden in the same cold valley, separated by who knows how many centuries, each one telling you something different about what people are willing to risk for the things they value most. There's a particular kind of melancholy in imagining how that thief's story might have ended, even though the game offers no definitive answer. Perhaps he found the ring, hid it as planned, and simply moved on with his life. The note and the trail left behind nothing more than an unnecessary precaution he never needed to rely on himself. Perhaps something far colder happened instead. A misstep on treacherous mountain stone. An encounter with one of the ogres or undead soldiers still said to wander these frozen ruins. A slow and quiet end in a valley far from anyone who might have come looking for him. The note he left behind never says, and the circlet of omnipotence waits there regardless, patient and indifferent to whichever version of events actually unfolded, content simply to be found eventually by whoever happens to follow the same careful trail of keys he once laid down for himself. Through a nightmare, darkly, in Bravil, a city built along the banks of the Niben that never quite escapes a certain reputation for grime and desperation, the Mages Guild Hall stands as one of the few places of genuine order. Its head, an Argonian spellsword named Kudai, runs the hall with quiet pride, the kind of leader who by every account would do nearly anything for the people under her care. There's something worth noting about Bravil itself as the setting for this particular story, a city that throughout the rest of the game tends to carry an air of poverty and quiet desperation, home to beggars and thieves, and a population that has, by most accounts, seen better days. The Mages Guild Hall standing within it feels almost like an island of stability by comparison, and Kudai's evident devotion to her closest friend takes on an added weight against that backdrop, as though her capacity for loyalty is one of the few genuinely uncomplicated good things this particular city still has to offer. Bravil's reputation as one of Cyrodiil's poorer, more troubled cities runs throughout much of the wider game, a place frequently associated with thieves, beggars, and a certain pervasive sense of decline compared to the wealthier settlements further north. Against that backdrop, the quiet, almost domestic intimacy of Kudai's worry for her friend feels especially striking, a small pocket of genuine warmth carved out of a city that the rest of the game rarely treats with much sympathy. It is easy to imagine her hall functioning as a kind of refuge, not just for the practice of magic, but for the simple human decency that the surrounding streets so often seem to lack. When you find her in distress, the reason becomes clear quickly. Her closest friend, a mage named Henantir, has not been seen in 3 days. He is not, strictly speaking, missing. He is simply not woken up. There's something quietly unsettling in how the game frames this absence, refusing the more dramatic language of disappearance in favor of something far more mundane and in its own way far more disturbing. A missing person implies movement, implies the possibility of being found somewhere else. A person who has simply not woken up implies the opposite. A body present and accounted for, breathing steadily, technically alive. while whatever made that person who they were has quietly drifted somewhere beyond easy reach. Kudai's fear is not the fear of losing Henantir to distance or danger in the ordinary sense. It is the far stranger fear of watching someone's body remain, while their presence simply, slowly, fades. Henantir, it turns out, had been experimenting with magic that strayed well outside what the Mages Guild's regulations technically allow. The kind of research that could see him expelled if it ever came to official attention. This is precisely why Kudai does not want to seek help through ordinary channels. Whatever has happened to him, she wants it resolved quietly, by someone with no stake in guild politics, by a stranger. She leads you to his house, where you find him exactly as she described, asleep and apparently unable to wake. The device responsible, she explains, is an amulet of his own creation, designed to let him consciously explore his own dreams, believing he could train and refine his magical abilities within a world entirely under his control. Instead, he has become trapped inside that very world, unable to find his way back out, and Kudai cannot follow him in herself. If she entered his dream, she fears, his own mind would simply dismiss her as a conjured memory, nothing more than a figment summoned by his subconscious. He needs someone real, someone his own mind has no reason to invent. There's something genuinely compelling in the internal logic of this particular magical conceit, the idea that a dreaming mind would more readily accept a fabricated version of a familiar face than it would a genuinely unfamiliar one. It suggests Henantir's dream is not simply passive, a world generated and then abandoned to its own devices, but reactive, capable of producing entirely convincing simulations of the people he knows best, simulations so convincing that even his own deepest subconscious cannot reliably distinguish them from reality. A stranger, paradoxically, becomes the only trustworthy presence precisely because the dream has no reference point from which to fabricate one, no memory to draw upon, no expectation to satisfy. Kudai's reasoning here, whether she fully understands the underlying magical theory or simply trusts her own intuition about how dreams seem to work, turns out to be entirely correct. That someone is you. The moment you equip the Dreamworld amulet and lie down on the bed beside him, the world changes entirely. Your inventory vanishes, save for the amulet itself. Those scattered items within the dream itself can still be collected and used. You find yourself standing inside a warped, disheveled version of Henantir's own house, and there, in the center of it, stands the man himself, confused, fragmented, having clearly lost pieces of his own mind somewhere within the architecture of his own creation. There's a particular vertigo to that initial transition, the floor beneath you dissolving into something else entirely, while the room around you remains, superficially, recognizable as the same house you just left. Familiar furniture sits at slightly wrong angles. Light falls in directions that don't quite match where any window could plausibly be. The unsettling effect is deliberate, a space built to feel almost right, while never quite settling into anything you could call comfortable. Exactly the sensation you might expect from stepping directly into the architecture of someone else's broken subconscious. He needs you to find what he's lost, specifically 4 qualities, scattered through the dream like physical objects waiting to be recovered. His patience, his perception, his courage, and his resolve. 2 tests wait on the upper floor of the dream house, and 2 more wait below, each one a small trial built from fragments of Henantir's own psyche, twisted slightly by however many days he has now spent trapped inside it. There is something genuinely unsettling about walking through a house you've never lived in and finding it nonetheless familiar. The way dreams so often borrow the architecture of real places while quietly rearranging the furniture of memory inside them. Overturned tables, cupboards that should hold nothing but somehow hold exactly what you need. A skill book sitting behind a bed at an angle that makes no architectural sense, as though logic itself bends slightly differently in here than it does in the waking world. Every test you pass returns a small piece of Henantir to himself, and by the time you've recovered all four, what's left standing before you feels less like the confused, fragmented man you first encountered, and more like someone slowly remembering who he used to be before his own curiosity led him somewhere he couldn't easily leave. The trials themselves vary in their particular challenges room to room, but one in particular has become infamous among long-time players. Equipping a strange amulet and walking into what the game calls the arena triggers a fight against Dreamworld minotaurs, monstrous and aggressive, with the gate ceilings shut the moment they appear. Many players have found the encounter brutal without the normal inventory of weapons and armor a character would usually rely on, leading to a small cottage industry of strategies, disarming the minotaurs entirely, retreating into narrow hallways too small for their bog to follow, or relying on whatever staff or makeshift weapon happens to be lying within reach inside the dream itself. It's a strange thing, fighting for your life inside someone else's subconscious, using nothing but whatever that subconscious happens to provide you. The dream does not arm you generously. It hands you scraps, half-remembered fragments of equipment that feel less like deliberate preparation and more like whatever Henantir's own troubled mind could conjure under duress. There is a kind of intimacy in that scarcity too, a sense that you are not simply visiting his dream as a tourist might visit a foreign city, but genuinely sharing in its limitations, fighting with whatever meager resources his own fractured mind has left lying around for you to find. What makes this entire questline worth sitting inside, beyond its puzzles and combat, is the strange intimacy of it. You are, quite literally, walking through the broken architecture of another person's mind, searching for pieces of his own character that he has somehow lost track of within his own imagination. It is, based on what we know of how dreams are often used symbolically across fiction, a question the game never quite answers outright. Did Henantir lose these qualities because his magic failed him? Or did some part of him, exhausted by years of careful, regulated practice within the guild, simply want to disappear somewhere, his patience and resolve no longer mattered at all? There's a particular sympathy worth extending toward Henantir once you consider his situation from this angle. A mage who spent years operating within the careful boundaries the Mages Guild demands of its members, only to discover, the moment he finally built something entirely his own, that even his own subconscious wasn't equipped to handle the freedom he'd been chasing. The dream he built for himself was meant to be a controlled space, a private laboratory free from institutional oversight. Instead, it became something closer to a trap, proof that even the most careful, well-regulated mind can lose itself the moment it's finally given room to wander without supervision. Many players believe this is the quiet underlying tragedy of the whole quest line. Not malice, not failure exactly, but the simple, very human discovery that total freedom can be just as disorienting as total restriction, sometimes more so. Once all 4 trials are passed, Henantir himself appears, restored enough to recognize the danger he's been in, and transports both of you back to the waking world. Your inventory returns. The amulet, in most cases, slips away from your possession as quietly as it arrived. though some clever players have found ways to keep it for themselves. Henantir rewards you with a handful of scrolls, scaled to your level, modest compensation for having walked through a man's broken subconscious and helped him stitch it carefully back together. There's a small, almost mischievous footnote to this entire questline worth knowing for anyone curious about it, concerning the handful of dedicated players who've managed to retain the Dreamworld amulet permanently, rather than losing it back to Henantir once the quest concludes. Based on what long-time documentation suggests, the trick generally involves completing a separate, unrelated quest from Kudai first, finishing that obligation before ever accepting the amulet itself, which apparently confuses the game's own internal tracking, just enough to leave the item behind, in your possession, rather than reclaiming it as intended. It is the kind of discovery that feels less like an intentional design choice and more like a small crack in the game's logic that patient, curious players eventually found their way through, turning Henantir's own dangerous experiment into a permanent souvenir for whoever happens to know the precise sequence required to keep it. Kudai, waiting anxiously the entire time at his bedside, tells you afterward that she never wants to speak of the dream world again, relieved beyond words that her friend is finally free of its grip. It's a small, quiet line, easy to miss if you don't speak with her again before Henantir himself seeks you out, but it carries the weight of someone who spent 3 sleepless days genuinely afraid she had already lost the person she cared about most, and is only now allowing herself to believe otherwise. There's a quiet tenderness in imagining what those 3 days must have felt like for Kudai specifically, sitting beside a friend whose body remained present while whatever mattered most about him grew increasingly uncertain, with no way of knowing whether he was simply dreaming or already lost somewhere she could never follow. The Mages Guild hall around her would have continued its ordinary business throughout, students and members coming and going, oblivious to the quiet vigil happening upstairs, and there is something deeply human in how she chose, in the end, not to escalate the matter through official guild channels at all, trusting instead in the kindness of a complete stranger, rather than risk her friend's reputation and standing, even while his very life hung uncertain. The Sirens of Anvil. Anvil sits along Cyrodiil's western coastline, a city of docks and sailors and the particular kind of gossip that travels fast through any port town. If you spend enough time listening to that gossip, you'll eventually hear about a peculiar string of robberies, all following the exact same pattern. Married men, lured by charm and flattery, vanishing for an evening and returning home considerably lighter in both coin and dignity. There's a wry, knowing tone to the way most townsfolk discuss it, the sort of gossip that carries equal parts pity and amusement for whichever poor husband happens to be the latest victim. Nobody in Anvil seems particularly alarmed by the pattern itself, more entertained by it, the way any small city eventually develops a fondness for its own running jokes, even at the expense of someone's reputation. It is, in its own way, the perfect cover for whatever is actually happening beneath the surface of all that laughter. Port cities, like Anvil, have always carried a particular reputation for this kind of opportunistic crime. Sailors and travellers passing through with full purses and limited local knowledge. Exactly the conditions a clever con artist might exploit indefinitely, without ever drawing serious official attention. Married men, specifically, make for unusually convenient targets in stories like this one, since shame and the desire to avoid domestic scandal frequently keeps them from reporting their losses formally, allowing whoever runs this particular operation to continue largely unchecked for as long as their victims remain too embarrassed to speak up. The trail leads to Gogan's house on the western edge of town, where you'll find Gogan himself alongside his wife Melona, in a conversation that is clearly more delicate than either of them wants to admit. Gogan, it turns out, fell for exactly the trick everyone in town has been quietly snickering about, lured by two women he met at the flowing bowl down by the docks, only to be robbed of his wife's ring, a family heirloom passed down through Melona's own mother. He is, understandably, mortified. Most men in his position, the rumours suggest, are too embarrassed by the whole affair to even report it. There's a particular tension worth noticing in the dynamic between Gogan and Melona during this initial conversation, one that becomes considerably more interesting once you eventually learn the truth about who they really are. Melona's concern reads, on a first encounter, like the worry of a wife more troubled by her husband's humiliation than by the loss of the ring itself, a portrait of quiet domestic embarrassment rather than genuine outrage. Gogan, for his part, seems almost more concerned with how foolish he must look than with the theft itself, the wounded pride of a man who fell for a trick everyone else in town apparently already knew to watch out for. Neither performance, in retrospect, feels like an accident. Melona, rather than dwelling on her husband's humiliation, asks you directly for help, promising a reward if you can recover the ring. Her suggestion is simple enough. Go to the Flowing Bowl, the same tavern where Gogan was first approached, and wait. It does not take long. Two women, Cini Homewrecker and Faustina Cartier, approach with practiced ease, and the nature of their proposition shifts depending entirely on who they're speaking to. If you're male, they invite you, with considerable charm, to join them for what they describe as a night of fun at their farmhouse just outside the city. If you're female, the approach changes entirely. An invitation instead to join their gang, woman to woman. An offer extended only to those they believe might share their particular skills. There's a real craft to how this scene plays out, regardless of which version your character experiences. The two women do not rush their approach, do not seem hurried or nervous the way amateur criminals so often do in fiction. They settle into the conversation with the calm confidence of people who have run this exact con dozens of times before, reading their mark, adjusting their tone, never once betraying the violence waiting at the end of whichever invitation they extend. It's the kind of performance that explains, better than any line of exposition could, why so many married men in Anvil have fallen for exactly this same trick, without ever suspecting a thing until it was already far too late. The Flowing Bowl itself, as a setting, deserves a small mention here. A dockside tavern that presumably sees a steady churn of sailors and travellers passing through, exactly the kind of anonymous, transient crowd that makes an operation like this one sustainable for as long as it apparently has been. Nobody at the bar particularly notices two charming women striking up conversation with a stranger, since that is, after all, precisely the sort of thing taverns like this one are built for. The Siren's entire operation depends on blending seamlessly into the ordinary social texture of a busy port, never standing out enough to draw the kind of scrutiny that might eventually expose them. Either way, the destination is the same: Gwydden Farm, southeast of Anvil, at 11 o'clock that night. The walk out to the farmhouse in the dark carries its own quiet tension, the kind that comes from knowing, as the player, exactly what's waiting, even as your character pretends otherwise. Arrive too early, and the door simply won't open. The thieves, it seems, keep to their schedule with surprising professionalism for a band of con artists. There's something quietly amusing in just how disciplined this supposed gang of seductive thieves turns out to be regarding their own operational timing. refusing entry before the appointed hour with the kind of bureaucratic punctuality you'd expect from a tax office, rather than a criminal enterprise built on charm and deception. It is a small, almost comedic detail, the idea that even a farmhouse ambush requires proper scheduling, but it also reinforces just how rehearsed this entire operation has become by the time you encounter it. A routine practiced often enough that its participants no longer deviate from the script even slightly, not even to accommodate an eager victim arriving a few minutes ahead of plan. Once 11 strikes and you step inside, Faustina Cartier greets you, and the conversation that follows plays out according to whichever invitation drew you here in the first place. An attempt at seduction for male characters, a continuation of the recruitment pitch for female ones. Either way, the moment you steer the conversation toward Gogan's stolen ring, the pretense collapses entirely. Faustina calls out, and her companions, including a third gang member, a Khajiit named Tsarina, emerge to finish what was clearly always meant to be an ambush rather than a courtship. The fight itself is brief, but not without its risks. These women may not wear heavy armor, but they hit considerably harder than their appearance suggests. And the unique enchanted dagger one of them carries, a blade called Witsplinter, capable of draining a victim's intelligence and magicka with every strike, makes clear this was never an amateur operation. There's something fitting about the particular enchantment carried on that dagger, given everything else this story is built around. Witsplinter does not drain health or strength, the kind of effect you might expect from an ordinary bandit's blade. It drains intelligence and magicka specifically, a weapon designed less for brute combat and more for incapacitating exactly the kind of victim these women were built to target, someone overconfident enough in their own cleverness to think they could never be fooled by a simple tavern seduction. The blade, in other words, punishes precisely the quality its victims most prided themselves on, which feels like a small, deliberate piece of thematic design rather than a coincidence. Once all three are dead, the door to the farmhouse opens, and in walk Gogan and Melona themselves, no longer dressed as ordinary townsfolk, but in the unmistakable armor of the Anvil City Watch. The reveal lands with a particular kind of dramatic satisfaction. They were never simply a wronged husband and his concerned wife. They were undercover officers the entire time, using their own carefully constructed cover story, and you, unknowingly, as bait to finally bring down a gang that had been operating with impunity for who knows how long. They thank you, reward you with a leveled sum of gold, and the special edition of the Black Horse Courier that follows announces the gang's downfall to the entire city under the headline "Anvil Tarts Thwarted." A small joke at the expense of the very thieves who spent so long thinking themselves clever. There's a particular satisfaction in seeing that headline circulate through the city afterward. A small piece of public record that finally, however jokingly, gives the whole affair the closure none of Anvil's previous humiliated husbands ever received. The published mockery this time lands squarely on the actual criminals rather than their unwitting victims, a small correction to months or years of gossip that had quietly blamed the wrong party for the city's recurring embarrassment. Many players enjoy tracking down a copy of that particular courier edition afterward, simply for the pleasure of reading the city's own newspaper finally getting the joke right. Before leaving, it's worth searching the farmhouse thoroughly. Looting Faustina's corpse yields not only the Witsplinter dagger, but also a key to the basement below, where the Sirens kept their accumulated spoils, stolen jewelry, coin and keepsakes taken from every married man unlucky enough to wander into the flowing bowl on the wrong evening. There is no mechanism in the game to return these items to their rightful owners. you are simply free to keep them. A small, slightly uncomfortable reward for having broken up an operation built entirely on betrayed trust. There's a particular discomfort in standing in that basement afterward, surrounded by other people's stolen heirlooms with no honest way to return them. Somewhere in the city above, husbands are still nursing their wounded pride, still being quietly mocked by neighbors who heard the rumors, never knowing that the very rings and trinkets taken from them sit now in a stranger's pack, recovered but permanently lost to them all the same. Justice, in this particular story, repairs the larger problem. The gang dismantled, the city safer, while leaving the smaller, more personal wounds of individual victims entirely unaddressed. A detail the game never dwells on, but never quite lets you forget either, once you've seen the basement for yourself. What makes this particular questline worth lingering on is how thoroughly it commits to its own deception, right up until the very last possible moment. Every clue along the way, the rumors, Gauguin's humiliation, Melona's plea for help, points toward a simple story of justice for a wronged married couple. Only in the final seconds, once the fighting is already over, does the truth surface that nearly everyone involved, on both sides of the conflict, was playing a part this entire time. Many players believe this is precisely why the quest rewards close attention rather than assumption. The most obvious story is rarely the whole story, and in a city built on docks and gossip and the slow accumulation of secrets, the truth tends to surface only after the last sword has already been drawn. It's worth noting too, just how thoroughly this small anvil story rewards a second look once you already know how it ends. Walk back through Gauguin's house after the quest concludes, and the details land differently than they did the first time through. His embarrassment was genuine, even if the larger scheme around it was not. Melona's worry for her husband's reputation, her insistence on quiet rather than public scandal, reads less like a wife protecting a fool and more like a fellow officer maintaining operational cover even within her own home. The married men of Anvil, still quietly mocked behind closed doors for falling prey to the sirens, never learned that their humiliation served a genuine purpose, that somewhere in the city's official records, an entire criminal operation was finally, carefully, dismantled because of the very embarrassment nobody wanted to talk about out loud. The captain who sold his city, Cheydinhal, rests in the foothills of the Vallis Mountains. Its red-tiled rooftops and Dunmer-influenced architecture marking it as a city shaped by its proximity to Morrowind as much as by Cyrodiil itself. It is governed by Count Andelindaris, the only non-imperial ruler among all the counts and countesses of the province, and for most of the game's history, that small distinction is simply a piece of trivia. Then Ulrich Leland arrives to take command of the city guard, and the trivia stops mattering because something far more troubling has quietly settled over Cheydinhal instead. There's a particular irony worth sitting with in how ordinary this corruption looks from the outside, at least at first. Ulrich does not announce himself as a villain. He does not seize power through violence or conspiracy. He simply arrives, takes up a position of legitimate authority, and begins slowly, methodically, bending the rules of that authority just far enough to enrich himself, while still technically operating within the letter of the law. It is the quiet, bureaucratic version of corruption, the kind that rarely makes for dramatic confrontation, and instead simply accumulates, fine by fine, eviction by eviction, until an entire city has been reshaped around one man's greed, without anyone quite being able to point to a single dramatic moment where it all went wrong. Cheydinhall's particular character among Cyrodiil's cities, shaped so heavily by the Dunmer refugees who settled there following the Red Year and the destruction wrought upon Morrowind, lends the entire story an added layer of poignancy. This is a city built in no small part by people who already understood displacement, who had already lost homes once before to forces entirely beyond their control. Watching that same community fall prey to a corrupt captain's manufactured fines and engineered evictions carries an extra weight given the city's own history of survivors rebuilding from loss. A community that should, in theory, have understood better than most exactly what was being taken from them, and yet found itself just as powerless to stop it from happening again. You won't need to search hard to find the first thread of this story. Linger in the streets, ask about rumors the way you might in any city, and the topic of fines comes up almost immediately, spoken with a particular bitterness of people who have learned that the law itself can be weaponized against them. Ever since Ulrich took over as captain, the story goes, the city has gone downhill. The guards hand out ridiculously heavy fines for every infraction under the sun. The kind of infractions that almost seem invented on the spot, purely so a fine can follow. Miss a payment, and the consequences escalate quickly. Your property seized, your name in the dungeon ledger. Nothing, the townsfolk will tell you with a kind of resigned shrug, that anyone can do about it. There's a particular kind of exhaustion in how the citizens of Cheydinhall discuss this situation, distinct from the outright fear you might expect under more dramatic forms of tyranny. Nobody describes Ulrich as a monster, exactly. They describe him the way people describe a persistent, grinding inconvenience that has simply become a permanent fixture of daily life. The kind of low-grade injustice that wears people down slowly, rather than terrifying them outright. Many players believe this tone is deliberate, the game choosing to model corruption not as a singular dramatic villain, but as a tedious, exhausting reality, the sort that real communities actually experience far more often than the sword-wielding tyranny more typical of fantasy storytelling. If you press further, you'll be pointed toward Levana Nedarin, the most outspoken critic of the new regime, a woman who clearly has had enough of watching her neighbors lose their homes to a man, who seems less interested in justice than in profit. She'll tell you about Aldos Othrin specifically, a local drunk who lost his entire house, his only home, because he simply could not keep pace with the endless fines stacked against him for nothing more than public intoxication and disorderly conduct, the precise kind of minor offense that, in a fairer city, might earn a stern warning rather than financial ruin. There's a particular fire to how Levana discusses this entire situation, distinct from the weary resignation you hear from most other townsfolk, where others have settled into quiet acceptance, treating Ulrich's corruption as simply an unfortunate fact of current life. Levana has clearly not made peace with it at all, and her willingness to actively organize against him, to direct strangers toward evidence and witnesses rather than simply complaining about her own misfortune, marks her as someone fundamentally different from the resigned majority around her. Many players believe she represents the version of civic conscience the rest of Cheydinhall has simply grown too tired to maintain, the lone voice still insisting that things could and should be better, even after watching neighbor after neighbor lose everything to the very system meant to protect them. Levana directs you toward Garrus Dorelion, Ulrich's own second-in-command, stationed inside Cheydinhall Castle. Garrus will not speak plainly about his superior right away. You'll need to earn his trust first, raise his disposition toward you through conversation and patience, before he's willing to risk what he's about to tell you. And what he tells you, once he finally does, is that he needs more than suspicion to bring a case before the Count. He needs a witness, someone who has suffered directly under Ulrich's policies and is willing to say so, formally, where it counts. It's worth noting how carefully Garrus protects himself throughout this entire exchange. A man clearly aware that speaking out against his own captain carries real professional risk, regardless of how justified his concerns might be. He does not volunteer information freely. He waits, measures your trustworthiness through nothing more than ordinary conversation, and only once satisfied does he finally let his guard down, enough to admit what half the city already suspects. There is a quiet kind of courage in that caution too. The courage of someone choosing to act against corruption from within a system that could just as easily crush him for trying, rather than abandoning his post entirely and leaving Cheydinhall's fate to chance. That witness is Aldous Othran himself, the very man whose ruin first drew Levana's attention. Finding him is its own small, sad scene. A man reduced to sleeping on a bedroll near Riverview because he no longer has walls of his own to sleep behind. Ask him about Ulrich, and what follows is not measured testimony, but a drunken, furious tirade. Years of resentment finally given somewhere to go. He insists on showing you rather than simply telling you, marching unsteadily back toward the very house that was taken from him, confronting the guard now stationed outside it, as though sheer outrage might be enough to win it back through force of will alone. There's something quietly devastating about watching this unfold, knowing as the player what Aldous himself seems unable to fully accept, that this confrontation was never going to end the way he needs it to. He is not approaching the situation with any plan, any leverage, any real hope of reclaiming what was taken from him through legitimate means. He is simply a man who has lost everything, walking unsteadily toward the one place that still represents what he used to have, propelled by nothing but grief and stubborn, drunken outrage. The guard standing in his way is, in his own small capacity, simply doing his job, enforcing rules that were never fair to begin with. And the collision between the two of them feels less like conflict and more like inevitability finally catching up to a man who never had the standing to fight it in the first place. It is not. Whatever happens in that confrontation, and the details vary slightly depending on how the moment unfolds, Aldous ends up dead, killed in the very doorway of the home he lost. A final, bitter consequence of a corruption that has already cost him everything else. There is something almost unbearably pointed about this detail. Many players believe Aldous was never meant to survive this quest at all, that his death is the entire reason the developers built this story in the first place, to show, plainly and without metaphor, exactly what kind of harm a corrupt official's policies inflict on the people who have the least power to resist them. There's something worth sitting with in just how preventable this death feels. Watching it unfold, knowing what you know as the player about the larger forces at work. Aldous is not killed by some grand conspiracy or hidden villain. He is killed by an ordinary, unnamed guard simply following standing orders, defending a property that technically, legally, no longer belongs to the man trying to reclaim it. The tragedy here is bureaucratic rather than dramatic, the inevitable, almost mechanical outcome of a system that has already decided Aldous' home belongs to someone else, regardless of how unjustly that decision was originally reached. His death is not a twist. It is simply what happens when desperate, drunken grief collides with the quiet, procedural machinery of a corrupt official's policy. Machinery that does not pause to consider fairness before it grinds forward. This could imply that the quest is not really asking you to solve a mystery, so much as it is asking you to choose how justice gets delivered, once the mystery has already solved itself. Returning to Levana with news of Aldous' death leaves her horrified and increasingly convinced that gentler methods are no longer adequate. She has her own plan now, one neither Garrus nor any official channel would ever sanction. And here, the quest splits into genuinely different paths, each one revealing something different about what kind of person you've chosen to be. If you speak with Garrus instead, he proposes the careful, legal route. Break into Ulrich's private quarters in the guard barracks, search for hard evidence of his corruption, and bring it back to be used against him properly. The best time to attempt this, long-time players have noted, is at night, while Ulrich himself sleeps upstairs alongside the rest of the garrison, unaware that the very evidence of his crimes is being lifted from atop a book on his own dresser. The letter you find there is damning in the most mundane way corruption usually is. A personal note to his own cousins discussing the money he's been quietly skimming from the fines levied against Cheydinhall citizens. The kind of small, careless paper trail that brings down men who assume nobody will ever look closely enough to find it. Bring that letter to Garrus, and the wheels of proper justice turn. Ulrich is arrested, incarcerated indefinitely in the very dungeons he once threatened to throw his own citizens into. And Garrus is promoted in his place, finally given the authority to undo the damage his former captain inflicted. It is the quiet, procedural ending, the one that asks nothing of you but patience and a willingness to wait 2 hours at the Cheydinhall Bridge Inn for your reward. There's something worth appreciating in how thoroughly this particular ending honors the actual rule of law it depicts, asking the player to gather evidence, deliver it through proper channels, and wait for institutional process to run its course rather than simply solving the city's problem through force. It is, in its own quiet way, the slowest and least immediately satisfying of the 3 available paths, requiring patience rather than action, paperwork rather than violence. And yet, it is also, many players believe, the path that leaves Cheydinhall genuinely healthiest in the long run, since Ulrich's downfall through legitimate evidence sets a precedent that corruption can be challenged and proven, rather than simply removed through whatever means happen to be available. A distinction that matters considerably more to the long-term health of a city's institutions than the swiftness of any single resolution. If, instead, you follow Levana's far darker plan, you're asked to lead Ulrich himself, unsuspecting, toward her home under some pretense, where she has prepared something considerably more final than a letter. Inside, the 2 of them speak briefly, and then, without warning, she paralyzes him and summons creatures to finish what words alone could never accomplish. It is swift, it is brutal, and when you report back to Garrus afterward, his reaction carries genuine disappointment. A man who clearly would have preferred evidence and due process over watching a corrupt captain torn apart in a private home by someone he was supposed to protect from exactly that kind of vigilante justice. He still rewards you because the city is undeniably better off, but the reward is smaller, and his praise is tempered by something that sounds almost like grief for the version of justice that didn't get to happen. There exists, quietly, a third option the game never quite endorses through any character's dialogue: simply killing Ulrich yourself, directly, without Levana's elaborate staging or Garrus's careful evidence gathering. The quest still resolves. Garrus still becomes captain, but he will openly berate you for the choice, and there is no reward waiting for you at all beyond whatever you can loot from Ulrich's corpse: a silver battle axe and a guard's chainmail. Modest compensation for a killing that solved the city's problem while solving nothing about what kind of person solved it. There's something pointed in how thoroughly the game punishes this particular shortcut, denying any meaningful reward to a player who simply skips past the careful moral architecture the rest of the quest was clearly built to provide. It would have been easy enough for the developers to treat all three outcomes as roughly equivalent, rewarding whichever method the player happened to choose with similar generosity. Instead, the direct killing path feels deliberately hollow, a reminder that the quest's real reward was never simply removing Ulrich from power, but rather the process by which you chose to do it, and a player who bypasses that process entirely is, in the game's own quiet judgment, left holding considerably less than those who took the time to do this properly. What makes this questline worth sitting with? Long after the gold has been counted, and the new captain has settled into his promotion, is how quietly it refuses to hand you a clean, moral answer. Every path ends with the same practical outcome. The fines, which scale noticeably higher for as long as Ulrich remains alive and in command, return to their normal levels once he's gone. The city heals, but the manner of that healing, evidence gathered patiently, justice delivered in shadow, or a blade drawn in anger, says something different each time about the player choosing it, and the game is content to let you live with whichever choice you made, without ever quite telling you which one Cheydinhal itself would have preferred. There's a particular weight to revisiting Cheydinhal afterward, regardless of which path you chose, and noticing how little the city itself seems to register the moral complexity you wrestled with on its behalf. Garrus settles into his new role. The fines quietly return to normal. Citizens go back to their business, largely unaware of exactly how their relief was purchased, whether through patient evidence or summoned vermin or a stranger's blade in the dark. Cities, it turns out, rarely care about the texture of their own justice, only its outcome, and there is something quietly sobering in realizing that the careful moral weighing you did on Ulrich's behalf mattered enormously to you, and almost nothing to the world you did it for.